Welcome to the Certified Kubernetes Application Developer Crash Course. This course has been prepared specifically to help you prepare for the CKAD exam. Now, the CKAD exam is one of the more challenging exams in IT at the time of writing. The course itself will cover areas around core concepts, configuration, multi-pod containers, observability, which includes monitoring and logging, pod design, we'll talk about services and networking, state persistence, we'll go through some practice exam scenarios, and then we'll close out the course. Before we get into the course, let's do a quick introduction into your instructor. My name is Joseph Holbrook, and I'm the CLO of Tech Commanders. I'm a highly certified course developer and author who also does hold the CKA exam as well. I also am a book author, and I'm widely published in areas such as DevOps, Google Cloud, and other areas such as blockchain. Let's go ahead and proceed now and find out what the course will provide us as far as learning reinforcements. We'll go through numerous Kubernetes demos. We'll be going through demos such as Minikube. We'll go through whiteboard discussions, documentation links, practice questions, and flashcards. With that said, we have a lot to cover. Let us get started and talk about the pre-requirements in the next lesson. Welcome to Module 2. In this module, we want to go ahead and cover some of the core concepts. We'll get started into what the exam is all about, why you want to get certified. We'll talk about the domains, about how they're going to cover each of the areas that you'll be tested on. We'll then get into the core concepts, which are really going to be the API primitives, what a pod is, how to create a pod, what the workflow is. We'll talk about life cycles of a pod, inspect a pod, and then we'll go into some demos on how to create a pod and inspect it as well. Let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to learn. What is the CKAD exam? So the CKAD exam is effectively one of the more challenging exams, of course, on the market right now. It's an area that has really high demand, such as Kubernetes, but it was really based on the fact that the cloud native computing foundation determined that there is certainly a need around a certification like this to help validate skills for Kubernetes developers. So if you're developing with Kubernetes, this is really the certification exam for you. So this exam is going to certify that you have the expertise, the hands-on knowledge on being able to work with Kubernetes and deploy applications basically with a Kubernetes-based deployment. So this exam is really, really important. Now, a lot of this exam, of course, is going to be similar to the CKA exam. Now, the CKA exam and the CKAD exam pretty much are the same content to a degree. So what I mean is the CKAD exam is about 70% of the content of what the CKA exam is. So if you take the CKAD exam and you pass, you would likely have a good chance of doing well on the CKA exam. Now, do I recommend you take both? Not really, because there's no real value, unless if you work for maybe a vendor or a training company, to have both. And in reality, if you pass one, as far as I'm concerned, you know what you're doing in Kubernetes, and I wouldn't really care if I was going to hire someone if it was going to be either cert. So that would be my point of view. But basically, this is a hands-on exam. So the way this exam is going to work, and I'll cover more about the exam at the end of the course, but just to make sure that you understand how the exam is going to work, is that you will be going through basically scenarios that are given to you, and you'll have up to 24 questions. Now, those questions are really called scenarios, really. And I'll walk you through some of these at the end of the course as well on how to answer the scenarios. So scenario could be basically going through and typing one, kubectl command. That's about it. Or it could be putting together a series of 6 or 7 syntaxes and then completing the solution that they're requesting. So this is an exam, again, that if you don't have the experience, typing Kubernetes, you really won't pass it. I just don't see how you would. But with that said, there's 24 scenarios. So they're task-oriented. So they're not multiple choice. They're not filling the answer like, 1 or 2 simple ones, right? It's more like exact syntax. And then each question is graded based on how well you did in the scenario. So just be aware of that. Now, it's, again, 100% hands-on. This is really the benchmark in the IT industry. So if you have the CKA or CKAD exam and you have the cert, as far as I'm concerned, you're an expert, because this is not an AWS exam. This is not a Google Cloud exam where it's multiple choice and you could wing your way through it if you have some experience, right? So this is really, again, so important. So I'll talk about the exam logistics. I'll talk about scenarios towards the end of the course. We have, of course, a lot more to cover before we get into that. Why get certified? Now, the reason we get certifications could be for any number of reasons. It could be that we want to get certified to prove our knowledge. It could be that we want to get certified because the job requires it. Or maybe we want to get another job and this will give us a leg up. Whatever that reason is, it's important to realize that the demand for Kubernetes certifications has skyrocketed. And this is especially true over the last 2 years. Now, companies are definitely requiring skills in Kubernetes. So whether you go out and get the CKA or the CKAD certification, I don't think you'll go wrong, at least at this point in time. Now, of course, demand is variable. It depends on where you live and your experience and the market sector that you work in. All of these things definitely matter as well. But basically, if you go to LinkedIn or Indeed or Glassdoor, whatever site you go to, you'll notice that the number of Kubernetes results will go up. And then the other thing I noticed too is that they're putting Kubernetes in just about every IT description now, it seems like. So it's there. Now, for example, for the CKA exam, the average pay is about $144,000. That's in the US. Now that number could be lower, it could be higher, and it's about the same for the CKAD. There isn't a lot of results for the CKAD because of the fact that the CKA just seems to have a lot more demand, and it's also a requirement for a lot of the vendors that basically are a partner of Kubernetes-based services. Now, in reality, either exam is hard. You still need to know the same syntaxes. You still have to do the same work. It's just that the CKA is more management of the cluster than the CKAD. So either way, the salaries are going to be high, whether you get the CKA or the CKAD. Now, we want to typically get certified, of course, for career advancement, job security maybe. And also, too, maybe you want to be on the leading edge of technology, and cloud native is really where it's at in the development world. And of course, if you get the cert, you're going to prove that you have hands-on experience with Kubernetes, because you won't pass this exam without that experience. It's just not going to happen. So with that said, we have a lot more to cover. Let's now get into the exam domain objectives. CKAD exam domains. So let's talk about what will be tested on in the exam. So when we take the exam, we always want to know before going into the exam, of course, what we're going to be tested on and to be able to prepare for the exam. Now, the domains are an excellent way to get an idea of what you're going to be tested on, at least at a high to mid level. Now, the domains for this exam are pretty clear. However, the exact areas that you'll be tested on and how you'll be tested may not be as clear. And that's why we're in this course. I'm here to break that down for you. So the domains are basically really clear as far as what you'll be tested on. Config maps, APIs, pods, etc., right? That we understand. But what exactly are we going to be tested on? So let's go ahead and talk about this. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that the exam, and this is true with, most vendors as well, the exams are developed with clear objectives, and typically you know where to find the answers to those objectives. What's nice about the CKA and the CKAD exam is that the objectives are clear and all of the information you need is already in the documentation. And when you take the exam, you have full access to the documentation during the exam. However, there's certainly going to be a routine you have to follow, and that's where you need the experience, right? So when we go into the exam, get to know the objectives before you take the exam, and then practice each of those, right? Each of those areas, go in and learn how to deploy a pod, right? So let's talk about what we're going to get tested on. All right, so the domains are weighted specifically as well. And this is also good to know because a lot of the vendors, whether it's in the cloud or development, let's say, they don't break down the percentage of what you'll be tested on. So CNCF has done that for you. So you know that 13% of the exam is going to be the basics, right? APIs. How do we access the API? How do we build a pod? How do we spin up a pod, right? Just that's your core concepts. Configuration is 18%. Multi-container deployments is 10%. So we'll need to know, for example, what an ambassador pod is and how do we deploy one, right? These are things that we want to know. Observability, logging, monitoring, troubleshooting. Pod design, services and networking, and state persistence. So you see that these are broken down. So let's talk about each of these. When it comes to core concepts, that's 13% of the exam, we want to know API primitives, and we want to be able to create and configure a basic pod. That's our core concepts. Now, when it comes to the next domain, this is going to be 18% of the exam. Okay, so this is going to focus on config maps, security contexts, resource requirements, create and consume a secret, and service accounts. So this really entails a lot of the deployment focus, and it really contains a lot of security related information that we'll go through. Now the next domain is multi-container pods. That's 10%, and there's really only one line item for this domain. So we'll need to understand the design patterns, for example, with different types of multi-container pods. The next domain is going to be observability. So we want to be able to understand these 4 areas. So it's liveness probes, readiness probes, container logging, how to monitor applications, how to debug. So that's really observability. That's 18% of the exam. So this is an exam area that we really need to get to know because this could make or break our passing of the exam. So it's just a lot there. Now, the next domain is pod design. And this is heavily tested, 20% as well. So we really need to know rolling updates, how to perform rollbacks, how to deal with jobs and cron jobs, labels, selectors, and annotations. And one thing we also want to keep in mind too is that this really builds, a course on top of the previous domains. The next domain is services and networking. And there's really only 2 areas. This is 13% as well of the exam. So understand services. So when we deploy a Kubernetes application, we need to be able to expose that service and know what to do from basically a deployment perspective. We also need to understand network policies. And then as far as the last domain is state persistence. That's 8%. This is the smallest chunk of the exam. And this is around what is called persistent volume claims. So we're going to need to know a little bit of storage for this exam. So if you are familiar with the difference between CKA and CKAD exams, you'll notice that the domains here are much lighter than they are for the CKA, especially around management, monitoring, etc. So with that said, that's our exam domains. Let's now proceed and get into the first discussion about the content around core concepts.